Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Davidson Boswell Show. I'm very happy to have our guest on today. His name is Alex Zambito. A lot of my followers will know him as SouthernCatholicWorker on Instagram. He is Catholic, Marxist, pro-Palestine, pro-John Brown. And I want to talk to him about that today. So first of all, Alex, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. So I was very struck by your belief system because I think, especially here in the United States, but maybe even worldwide, Catholicism is often thought of as a kind of conservative ideology. Um, but you call yourself a Catholic Marxist. And I'd be curious to know about, like, first of all, how you came to your Catholic faith, how you came to like believe in the teachings of Marx, the philosophy of Marx, I guess you could say, and how you draw inspiration from both, and how you see those philosophies intertwining.
Yeah, so I guess my original involvement with the Catholic Church is being raised Catholic. So I was raised in a small town called Richmond Hill, just a little bit outside of Savannah, Georgia, and a parish called St. Anne's, and it was like a pretty relatively conservative parish, as you can imagine, being like a kind of a smaller town in the South. So that for me was that for me is like an experience that's brought me back and also alienated me in a kind of a weird way. By that I mean like I kind of got alienated more when I was like in high school and college from like a lot of the conservatism. So like for me, I actually went through like a pretty well, decently long kind of Richard Dawkins anti-theist phase where I really loved like
But
Richard
yeah,
Dawkins.
the YouTube, that was like the dawn of YouTube, was like looking at Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, like putting down God in a very like, snarky way.
Yeah, and I went to when I was in high school at a Catholic. I went to a Catholic all boys military school. So when I was at that school, I
Right.
would walk. I was like the guy. I was the kid that like walked around with like the God delusion. By Richard Dawkins, kind of like
Right.
being a little, so a little bit,
Contrarian shit.
yeah, a little bit contrarian at the time. So I think that was kind of like what alienated me from the Catholic Church, kind of being in that sort of very conservative environment where like there's really presented like there's only one way of interpreting the Catholic faith and its teachings, and particularly never like really being exposed to like Catholic social teaching, which actually like when I was in high school and started, like we did go cover that in one of my religion classes. I was like, huh, this does not sound like anything that I've ever like experienced with my faith or with my church up until now. But also like
Interesting.
part of
So yeah, talk to me more about that. Like what is an example of like a Catholic social teaching?
well, so I mean, Catholic social teaching is uh, hmm, kind of like I mean very obviously based off of like a lot of what Jesus says about like caring for the poor and caring for other people. So like one of the key tenets of like Catholic social teaching is like preferential option for the poor. So that means like that kind of comes out of like liberation theology, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But kind of like the idea that like the viewpoint of the poor is kind of like the one we need to prioritize when looking at like our faith, in particular like when looking at economics, is um, that our economic system should be like more fair, actually prioritize taking care of people and making sure they have like their basic needs met. That's kind of like a pretty essential like teaching of it, although I would say it's not socialist like to be like explicit about that. Catholic social teaching does not like advocate socialism. It's more of like what's I think called distributionism or distributist like idea, where basically the idea that it opposes like the high concentration of capital and make a more equal society, but doesn't necessarily like oppose capitalism. So I would say I would kind of describe it more as a little bit more like social democracy, but still like a
Right.
lot different from like what we're presented with. Like it definitely would be a rejection of like neoliberalism and like the like laissez-faire capitalism. Like it has the very strong rejections of like how workers and the poor are treated under that system. So that is like so basically in a lot of ways it is essentially socialist without saying it in some ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing about like it's interesting to hear you say that. And I think like we can kind of watch the culture move, particularly among like Gen Z and millennials, like being called a socialist or a Marxist with the current like basically collapse of the neoliberal consensus. like market supremacy is the only thing that matters in society, um, is interesting because it doesn't affect people. Like, my mom, for instance, grew up very religious. She's like, that Davidson, that's communist. I'm like, yeah, you're exactly right. That's exactly what it is. Like, yeah, you nailed it. So, okay. So at what age range are we talking where you started like coming back to your faith, learning more about like Marxism? And then, um, when did you start kind of like, feeding those philosophies into, liberation movements, like knowing like, oh, this is related to like the Palestinian struggle, for instance?
So I think like part of the reason I do like end up coming back to the church is actually still from my like original parish from back home, because like it is still like kind of a sense of community. And like even I think a lot of people like stay with their churches because of that. Like church is like the first instance they have of like being in a community, and that's like just yeah, that's just like together. I mean, every Sunday at least, or just get to know each other. And that was kind of a big part for me. Is like my church, my parish when I was a kid was pretty small. Like everyone kind of like knew each other, so it was that was like where we would go. Like uh, we like I'd play with friends outside the church. Like we had a playground outside the church, and like we would play together, like that sort of stuff. So like it is kind of like the first place that people like really kind of experience community. So that's kind of like one of the reasons they go back. So for me, like the even though I was like kind of alienated from like some of the more substantive, like I guess religious and like political beliefs in my parish, I was like still felt like that's sort of like community presence. And that's kind of like what I guess brought me back to the church. So like first I go, I mean I probably became I guess like Richard Dawkins style atheist like 16, 17 when I was in high school, and then that kind of went for me through college. And then in college, I would probably describe myself more as like a rad lib, like a radical liberal. But so like kind of like having the
Right.
dressings of radicalism, but still being pretty liberal. Like still thinking like The Economist is a cool paper or something like that. Uh, Instead of like what I think Lenin described it as well, like the mouthpiece of like the British bourgeoisie or something like that. But yeah, once I when I grad
Yeah, I forget how old The Economist is. It's been around for a long time. Just as a side note, and sorry, don't move your hands over the like table. I think it's like hitting the speaker or something like that because I keep getting like feedback from it. So yeah, just be careful with that. Yeah, man. I mean, like, do you still? This is kind of an aside, but do you still find any value in like reading liberal thought in any way, or have you like kind of moved completely away from that? Because I think it's important sometimes to like know what the opposition is saying, and like how the world is contextualized, but I'm skeptical that we're ever going to get any like actual intellectual sustenance from it. It's almost just like hate reading at this point.
Yeah, I agree with that. For the most part, it is kind of like I'm gonna pick up this paper and it's just gonna make me mad. Um, but I also do think there's
Right.
like some I think there's some value in it, particularly just like in the case of like media criticism, because like when you think about it, like the media still has like a very powerful ability to like shape opinion. So being able to like critically engage with it and help other people understand like where is this trying to like lead me? What is this trying to make me think? Whose voices are being prioritized and whose voices are being like excluded. So when you do that, like, because I mean, whatever, I think, no matter what, we're not gonna living in the United States, you're not going to get away from like liberal or like mainstream media, corporate media. Like that's always going to be something you're exposed to, and even if like you try to avoid it, you're gonna see it, and it's still going to shape your opinion. So being able to like critically engage with it, I still think is important.
Right. And yeah, I think a big part of your social media presence is like calling out like liberal hypocrisy. A lot of the stuff that you've posted lately is about like this delayed recognition of Gaza. Like I know the last thing you posted was about like Microsoft like finally being like, "Oh, you can't like make a database of Palestinians with our software to kill them." And it's like, "Well, they've been using your software for decades." Like it's like I guess I mean like we should take pride in that. Like all this increased scrutiny has brought about some level of reckoning, perhaps too little, too late. So when did you start? When did you start like okay, well let me preface it this way. There are Catholic churches in Palestine. Is that kind of how you arrived? I mean, like you don't need it to be related to your Christian faith in order for you to care about people dying, right? But was that something that piqued your interest, or was it unrelated and you just kind of use your Marxist Catholicism as a lens to understand the conflict? Or I guess just how did, yeah, yeah, that's my
For me, it was
question.
like my interest in Palestine. I think Palestine actually had a pretty large role in like radicalizing me. It was actually learning more about
Hmm.
Palestine. Like when I was in high school, I did like Model UN, and I represented Palestine when I was in high school. And like
Cool.
learning that, yeah, like reading into it a little bit there, kind of like got me thinking more, a little bit more radically, and then kind of more exposure to the well, not conflict, the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestinians has kind of radicalized me. And like what you mentioned about hypocrisy is, I think like liberal hypocrisy is like, in some sense, I think we're kind of in a political moment where we're kind of like post hypocrisy, in that like no one ever, I think everyone kind of understands that politicians and liberals and conservatives, no matter what, are full of shit, and they don't really care that they're full of shit. So like pointing out
Yes.
hypocrisy has
Yes.
like limited value. But I also think that like there's still plenty of people who don't realize that politicians are full of shit. So um kind of like still pointing that out is useful. But in terms of like, yeah, with Palestine, that was kind of like a big, for me, like understanding how like the neoliberal like human rights framework consensus that's like supposed to be around the world was, bullshit. Like that, I mean, this was like this whole thing, like a country that is essentially like under the auspices of the UN, um is basically carrying out like a genocide, and like all of this hand people will do hand wringing about human rights, but then not actually ever do anything. So like that was kind of like seeing that, like you can just see the major contradiction between what politicians and what like world leaders say and what they are actually doing. And that's kind of like a big part for me, is prioritizing what politicians actually do instead of like what they actually say. And that was kind of like a big part for me, for being radicalized. I think with Marxism, I kind of become Marxist more after I've graduated college, and I'm like actually, for a little bit, I went back to Savannah. I went to Georgia Tech for college, and I went back to Savannah, and I was working in restaurants for a while, just like because I was just trying to spend some time with my family, and just like working in restaurants in, even in a like a small town, you're just like, or a smaller city,
Yeah.
you're just like, this is entirely bullshit. Like I'm shucking oyster. I
Yeah.
was an oyster shucker at a pretty fancy restaurant, making $12 an hour, and it was miserable. I hated it. I got yelled
Busting
at
your
all the,
ass. Yeah.
yeah, and you're not making enough, and you're basically just busting your ass like for these bougie people that come in and get like $40 bits of foie gras, and like, and that, that's what the, and like right, literally like 2 blocks away is like the I guess projects or whatever of Savannah called Yamacraw. And it's just like, that you see that like that disparity, that big difference. Like there's this fancy place, and then right next to this is just this pretty intense poverty, even though it's like in the supposed like the, the richest country in the world. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, just like kind
Yeah.
of see.
To eat like foie gras in the shadow of a project building is pretty dead on for the late stage capitalism that we're existing in right now. I live across from project buildings as well. New York is so heightened, and then Central Park is one. Actually, I'm not gonna say where I live. Okay, that's gonna be. But like yeah, I'm very close to Columbia University, very close to like poverty as well. So you see these like international students riding around in like Bugattis essentially, and then you're like, wow, this person like doesn't have any legs. So so let me ask you. And I know this is a bit of an abrupt transition, but I would really benefit from knowing about this too. Who are some Catholic revolutionaries or thinkers that you think people should kind of gravitate towards, read from, learn from, that you've gotten a lot out of over the years?
So I think that's, I actually think there's plenty of inspirations, like we talked about, is that the church has like always been kind of viewed as conservative. I would say that's more like a projection of like what conservatives in the church want us to believe. So people like J.D. Vance and others like to, they convert, join the faith, and use it as a way to kind of like justify or explain their conservative beliefs, and then present themselves as like the true Catholics, when there's always been kind of like other more liberatory strands in the Catholic Church, and just in Christianity in general. So I mean, you go back in history, read like some of the early like church fathers. Like one of my favorites is Saint Basil. He has like all of this like very strong teachings about social justice, basically talking about like condemning the accumulation of wealth, condemning the privatization of land, and like things that he says are supposed to be common for all of people. So like you have like all of these old church fathers that have like very clearly values on like social justice that go against what we are like taught in like modern capitalism, and particularly even the way they acted, like about close to 2,000 years ago, uh, is very different from. It goes against. It's very subversive in a lot of ways. Like some of like the early church fathers, like selling off. Like I know Saint John Chrysostom, who has like there's some he is a mixed bag in a lot of ways, but he like would when he became bishop, he like sold off all of like the fancy things in the cathedral wherever he was, and like gave it to the poor, and like was very big
Ooh, that must have
establishing.
pissed some people off.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's awesome. Yeah.
so you have like these old like kind of more I guess ancient church figures from a long time ago that had very like clear beliefs about social justice and advocacy for the poor, and then follow that through to like people like John Ball, who was he was a priest during the Peasants' Rebellion in England. So he was like a very big inspiration for that. So that's kind of like an example of like even in medieval times having like a revolutionary like religious figure. And then you even go through like even after that, like during the English Civil War, you have like the Diggers and Gerard Winstanley, and having a very kind of strong position on the common, like basically common ownership over land and over resources that come from the earth. And then so even going all the way back to those times, you have like these liberatory ideas from the Christian tradition, and then in more recent
And
times,
when are we talking like 1700s, 1600s, like for instance, like the Peasants Rebellion, like when was that
I
roundabouts?
think the Peasant Rebellion I think is in like the 14th century, so it's like it's more like the
Wow,
fourth.
medieval.
I'd
Yeah.
have to I'd have to get the exact dates because I'm not an expert on English
No,
history.
I just wanted like a rough time frame. Yeah,
Yeah,
this is listen. Not a lot of preparation goes in this podcast. So, okay, well, that's really interesting, man. I think that's really valuable for people to kind of see the strain of like, I don't know. For the longest time, there was so much illiteracy in the world. You know what I mean? And religion was a way to like bring that. And I feel like there was an opportunity a lot of times for like religious leaders to like actually use the teachings of Christ or Muhammad to try and uplift their people. I think that's such a valid point about like the Charlie Kirkification of the church being like empathy is a weakness. But if you look at the like actual, you know, by and large, the philosophy is about liberating the poor.
and
So
well, I just wanted
go
well,
ahead. Yeah.
more like recent times we have more like liberation theology. So that's like kind of largely the two of like the big figures in that are Leonardo Boff and Gustavo Gutierrez, who are like kind of the two big time like writers for that. But they're two priests from like Latin and South America. That's kind of like where the liberation theology tradition comes from, and their emphasis is on like the idea that Christ's mission was to be in solidarity with the poor and to like help fight for or like help push for their liberation from unjust practices. And that's kind of like one of the main reasons why he gets crucified is that he was a challenge to existing power structures. And one of the kind of central figures in liberation theology is Saint Oscar Romero, who I have him on my wall somewhere. Oh, he's right. You can see him right there. The guy like the
Cool.
top, but
There he is.
yeah, he was a big figure. He was the Archbishop in El Salvador in the late 1970s until 1980 when he was assassinated. And his assassination is kind of like considered one of the starting points of the civil war in El Salvador. And he's like these figures are central to me because they show an example of where like communists and Marxists, at least while they didn't, while like these Catholic priests weren't like aligned necessarily like communists, they at least collaborated and were willing to work with them and even defend them from like state repression. And like even in El Salvador, one of the things was that like, and this is like kind of a common thing that's happened throughout the church, is that people said like communists have like infiltrated the church, and now they're trying to make the Vatican communist and all this other stuff. And they did that with Pope Francis, but they did that in Latin America and Central America too during a lot of these like movements. Like in El Salvador, they had propaganda that said like be a patriot, kill a priest, because they're saying that the Jesuits priests were
Wow.
they're basically accusing them of being communists. And I don't know if you've ever heard of a man named Ignacio Ellacuría, or he's one of the Jesuit, I believe it was 6 people that were assassinated at the UCA, which is the Central University of Central America. Him, I think there's 2 other. Wait, I have them on my wall. So there's like 8 people who
Yeah.
they're up there too. They were assassinated by like right wing like militia squads. They were like literally were just like they lived in the UCA as like teachers and like priests and stuff, and they were like pulled out of their beds and like shot in the middle of the and shot, assassinated. So so you have like all of these figures who, because of their like work with the poor, because of their like willingness to collaborate with even like communist guerrillas, that they get assassinated. And yeah, there's a kind of point on one more
Okay.
person. There's
Yeah, of course.
also Ernesto Cardenal, who he wrote the Gospel in
Mm-hmm.
Slentaname, which was he was a priest that went to went to be the priest in a small like remote village in like an island archipelago or something, however you say that word,
Yeah.
in
Archipelago, I think.
Nicaragua.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in Nicaragua. And basically the Gospel in Slentaname, the book, is like a publishing of like the conversations that he had with the people, the peasants in his village. Like he would talk about the Bible, have conversations with them. Like they'd read a passage, and then everyone would go around and just kind of talk about what did this mean to them. And it kind of showed that people, the poor, the oppressed, can like make their own theology. They can kind of come up with their own thoughts of like what God is doing in their lives. And it's like very connected to like Paulo Freire and his pedagogical method of popular pedagogy and conscientization. However, yeah, again, another word that's hard to
Yeah,
say.
that's a
But
mouthful. Yeah.
yeah, so like those, like all of these connections, like Paulo Freire is one of my like main inspirations, just as someone who like values education, and his collaboration with liberation theologians is like important for me.
That's so cool, man. Yeah, I think if especially in this moment, if we could like just highlight people who faced really long odds. It does suck that sometimes the story ends that they were pulled out from their bed and shot, you know what I mean? But I mean they did move the ball forward for the poor. Um and I think it's important to emphasize those people for sure. Um So this will be my last question for you, and I think it's really important. He's one of I think one of the original reasons I started really following your content was your adoration for John Brown. Asada Shakur just died, another figure that um, did not stop with words, when it came to fighting systems. Um, so John Brown famously led a slave rebellion. He was a deeply religious man. A lot of people credit him with really inciting the Civil War in a lot of ways, scaring white slave owners to a level where they felt like their livelihoods were going to go away. So enormously important. So I just want to know uh, why you think he's so important and why you look up to him so much. So yeah, please tell us about John Brown as best you can.
Yeah, for me, the importance of John Brown is he is a person that really showed like kind of tremendous solidarity with the oppressed and the people he set out to serve. So uh, he like was an example of like someone who's a person from the dominant group, a white person, which as you can tell I am as well. So just like kind of a good example for model of behavior for someone who wants to be in solidarity with the oppressed. He looked around his society, saw that it was fucked up because slavery is bad, because chattel slavery
Yeah.
is wrong, and he acted accordingly. He saw what was wrong, and he didn't like sit and kind of like mope about it or try and make excuses or like let like guilt or whatever like stop immobilize him. He just jumped into action. And particularly what was important about him is not just that he was, I think he's kind of has this uh is that he was compared to like even other abolitionists at his time at the time, is that he was not just like um it's like a lot of abolitionists at the time were also still pretty racist. They had like views of black people that they were like still inferior and kind of like childlike. And John Brown rejected that entirely and believed that like part of the reason he does his the raid on Harper's Ferry is because he believed that black people would be willing to like fight for the freedom. He believed that not only that they were willing to and that they are capable of doing that, which is something that other abolitionists, even like figures like William Lloyd Garrison, did not believe. They did not believe that black people were capable of like fighting for their own freedom. So John Brown, as a person that not only showed solidarity with other people, but believed in their ability to like liberate themselves. So like even when his home in North Elba, he established, well, he doesn't establish the town. He One of his backers, George Stearns, is the person that basically buys property, and he's up in upstate New York, and he establishes that as a place for free black people to go like live and establish farmsteads. And Brown goes up there to try and like help, basically, and he kind of thinks about his role as like kind of an experiment to show that black people and white people can like live together in full social equality. So he went up and lived in North Elba, and he just treated people like black people as if just treated them equally. And that was like kind of a huge, and people who saw it were scandalized by it. They're like, wow, he calls these black people ma'am and sir, and like invites them to dinner and goes
Wow.
to their just like, and his just not even just that he did that, is that he viewed himself as like kind of as a servant. And when he made major decisions, he didn't just like do it like make them themselves. He explicitly always made sure to ask his black like comrades like what are their opinions that they should do. Like when he decides to go to Kansas to join in like where he becomes famous, where he gets also with Tommy Brown. Um, when he decides to go there, he explicitly in a letter to his wife asks, "Hey, make sure you ask the Epps, who were a black couple that lived in North Elba. Make sure to ask them what their opinion on what I should do is." And like when he decides to do Harper's Ferry, he always consults with other like black abolitionists like Harriet Tubman and like Frederick Douglass and others who are and so just like his, it's not just like what he does. What he does is very important, obviously, because it kind of ends up being the trigger for why the South decides to secede. But it's just like his approach to the people who he sought to serve as like people that he believed were fully capable of liberating themselves. And also just that he was, even though he has the reputation of just being, an abolitionist, he was pretty progressive on other measures too. So like his attitudes towards indigenous people and towards women. So like when people who visited the Brown family, one thing they noted is that pretty much everyone shared like all of the chores equally, which again was not always very common. So like men would do would do like a lot of the household chores that were typically considered for women. He also was, I believe, he was supportive of women's suffrage. I'd have to like double check. Like I'm pretty sure he supported like basically women early like women's rights campaigns. And also, yeah, like I said, on his attitude towards indigenous people, there's like one story where indigenous people would kind of like go through this town in order to like make it to the hunting grounds or something like that. And the people of the town that he was living in came up to him and were like, "Hey, you want to help us like drive these indigenous people off so they can't come through the land anymore?" And he was like, he basically told them to kick rocks. He was like, "I've never heard of such like a mean thing, and I would rather take up a gun and fight you than fight them." And I think that's pretty cool.
Hell
So
yeah.
So like just
That's a
like all
really effective way of saying no. It's like, I'll shoot you if you ask me that again.
so
Well, that's so cool, man. I think, yeah, he's a model example. I can't really be like, go do what he did without getting kicked off of YouTube and Patreon, but whatever. Well, dude, thank you so much for coming on. I learned a lot just by talking to you. If you, so where can people follow you? What organizations do you recommend? Like, where should people look to find your work and read you?
yeah, so you can follow me on my Instagram, Southern Catholic Worker. The organization I'm mainly with is the Catholic Worker. I don't know if we how familiar you are with us, but so I can explain really quick. The Catholic Worker was founded during the Great Depression by Dorothy Day and Peter Morin. Dorothy Day is currently like under consideration to become a saint in the Catholic Church, but basically established a couple houses of hospitality here in New York City. I live at one of them called St. Joseph's House. Basically, we run soup kitchens out of both of our houses. Monday through Friday here, we run a soup line out of the kitchen. So guys come in, get to sit down, have a nice meal, talk to each other, and get coffee. They love coffee, especially the coffee and sugary drinks, which is
Right.
I
Yeah.
question sometimes the amount of sugar we use, but yeah, they can guys can come in and just like sit down and have a meal, and that's kind of like what we do. It's like more of a just a community that like works together to serve people. So that's mainly so the Catholic Worker would be one of the better ways to kind of find me. I've written for our paper a couple times, so that
Cool.
and
Yeah.
yeah, I do have a Substack with under the Catholic Worker, Southern Catholic Worker. So yeah, those would be the best places to find me.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I need you to stick around for a second after I click stop so this uploads. But thanks again. See you, dude. Bye.